Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Mission of Norway. I hope you all have been able to get something to eat and drink, and it's self-service throughout, so you can sneak some food and drink and have it while you're participating in this launch as well. We are really pleased here at the Mission to co-host, together with Japan, the launch of the latest Women, Peace and Security Index, made possible by Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security and the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO. So, this is an important year. The UN is 80, and the Security Council Resolution 1325 is 25. We have come a long way in advancing the WPS framework. There are 115 national action plans for women, peace and security, including Norway's 5th edition of the plan, and it's a clear testament of a targeted and global commitment to ensure women agency in all matters related to peace and security. However, we are not where we should be in terms of implementation. For instance, when it comes to mediation, none of the peace agreements reached in 2023 included a woman representative as a signatory. We have not achieved what we set out to do and ensured that women take their rightful place in mediation efforts. But the situation is in fact going in the wrong direction. The 2025 Global Peace Index notes that the world has become less peaceful over the last 17 years. We see a proliferation of conflicts. The mediation space is occupied by many different actors. And in other words, the world has become more complex. Therefore, we need research and evidence to help us understand how we can improve. Better data helps us identify gaps and tailor interventions to the realities all around. That is why the Women, Peace and Security Index matters. The index contributes to improving our strategies and our action plans. It creates tangible measures, which again can produce tangible results. I also want to highlight the importance of multilateral platforms. Norway is currently co-chairing the Focal Point Network together with Japan. The communiques from the Focal Point Network meetings in Tokyo and Oslo this year are now recognized as the official UN documents, and they reflect a joint commitment to evidence-based action in advancing the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So I am looking forward to the presentations this afternoon. I have promised the organizers to tell you all that this meeting is being recorded. So if you don't like it, you have to leave now. But with that, it's my pleasure to give the floor to my Japanese colleague, Ambassador Yamazaki Kazuyuki. So, Kazu, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your thank you very much for your introduction, and also we are very privileged to be able to co-host this event at the Norwegian Mission. We are always working very closely to promote this agenda in Europe. And also, at the outset, I'd like to extend thanks to the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and PRIO Center, Gender, Peace and Security, for organizing this event. And I'd like to thank all the participants who are present here. Japan is pleased to co-host this event in launch of the 5th Global WPS Index, particularly along with the Norwegian Mission, as we have the honor to serving together as co-chairs of the WPS Focal Points Network for 2025. In this capacity, Japan hosted 3 meetings, including a side event during the recent high-level week that demonstrated ministerial commitments from all regions. Japan will continue to engage with the network to foster inclusive dialogue, share best practices, and strengthen international cooperation. But this year marks the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 1325. Japan is deeply concerned by the growing backlash against women's rights. Conflict, displacement, humanitarian crisis, and sexual violence continue to hamper women's empowerment and undermine progress in implementing the WPS agenda. In this context, the 3 key dimensions of women's well-being that are covered by the index, inclusion, justice, and security, are more relevant than ever to analyze. Regrettably, the lack of significant improvement in the index's average scores since the first edition in 2017 shows that overall progress in women's status continues to slow. It is encouraging, however, that some of the biggest improvements in the indicators emerged from fragile and conflict-affected states. This finding strengthens efforts by the international community, reinforcing a holistic and collaborative approach between governments, civil society, and women leaders on the ground. In the face of current challenges, now is the time to recommit ensuring full respect for the rights of women and girls. Japan attaches the highest importance to the realization of gender equality and respect for women's rights and underscores the necessity of addressing structural barriers that hinder women's leadership and for meaningful and safe participation in peace processes and diplomacy. To this end, Japan will host the Next Generation Forum of Gender Equality this December, focusing on gender issues, including WPS, to promote research and discussion among young people. This initiative aims to cultivate the next generation and build networks to drive the advancement of gender equality. The commencement of Japan's first female Prime Minister, Ms. Sanae Takaichi, will boost the momentum behind this initiative. I look forward to hearing today's briefings and subsequent discussions and hope that the index can serve as a valuable tool to inform the way forward. Japan remains committed to implementing the WPS agenda and will continue to actively engage partners in this area, including those who are present today. Now I have the honor to introduce our next speaker, Marlene Verbier, Executive Director of Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, former U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And it is a great pleasure to be here with Ambassador Bratested again. Thank you for hosting us once again, bringing us together for the launch this time of the 2025 Women, Peace and Security Index. And as she pointed out, it is particularly timely that we do it on the 25th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security resolution that was first adopted 25 years ago this coming Friday. So we couldn't have a more timely observance in this way. Norway has been our partner in this endeavor since the inception of the index in 2017, and for that we could not be more grateful. I also want to thank Norway's Special Envoy for Women, Peace and Security, Signe Gillen, who is here. Signe has been a strong leader on WPS for Norway, but also a global leader, and we're very grateful to her for her engagement on our common cause. I'm also happy that our co-collaborator on the index, PRIO, is with us today, and you will be hearing from their research director as well as the director for their Center on Gender, Peace and Security. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Japan. and its leadership on women, peace, and security. As you heard, they not only were the co-chairs with Norway on the Focal Points Network, but Japan has become a really important leader on WPS, and in the last really few years, just an extraordinary commitment has been made by their government on this issue. And they have shared with us greatly on the women, peace, and security agenda their expertise and experience on disaster risk reduction. The index constitutes the most comprehensive ranking to date of 181 countries on the well-being of women. It goes beyond the dimension of inclusion. We all know what that means: women's political participation, economic participation, education, very important. But it also adds the dimensions of justice. How are women discriminated against? And security. Are women safe in their homes? Are they safe in their communities? It is the first index of its kind to be developed within the framework of the SDGs. We are hoping that the index will continue to illuminate future actions of leaders and policymakers alike to improve the status of women. It's also a valuable tool for activists to hold governments accountable for their promises to advance the well-being of women. Countries are more peaceful, prosperous, and democratic when women are accorded full and equal rights and opportunities, and this is an evidence-based case. We also know that they're better prepared to adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change. And in those nations where women's condition is extremely poor, those nations are at the bottom of the ranking, as you will hear, and they are suffering from fragility, instability, and yes, conflict. Indeed, the condition of women and the condition of nations goes hand in hand. And today we are seeing a rising backlash against women's progress. Repressive laws are being passed, and many of those laws advancing gender equality are being repealed, including laws on violence against women. And this rising authoritarianism is accompanied by campaigns of disinformation and an assault on women's inclusion and equality. So this is a challenging time, and all of us must remain committed, and I know we will be undaunted in this task. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Siri Oss-Rustad to the podium. She is the research director, research professor at PRIO, where she leads their work on the Women, Peace, and Security Index. And she is going to brief us on the situation of women exposed to armed conflicts. And today's conflicts, regrettably, are increasing and growing more deadly. Siri.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the research that I do, which goes into this index. So I'm going to talk about exposure of level of exposure to conflict by women. But first, I'm going to say a little bit about the level of conflict that we see in the world today. So we all have this feeling that the world is becoming more dangerous, and there's more conflict. And unfortunately, that is the case. 2024 was the year with the highest number of conflict that has been recorded since 1946. We also saw that 2024 was the fifth highest or most violent year since the Cold War. So the year with the highest level of battle deaths. Just passed by the three preceding years and 1994 with the Rwandan genocide. Throughout history, there's always going to be big conflicts. That's almost inevitable. But what is particular with the past 5-6 years is that there has been a lot of big conflicts that are taking over from each other. So we see these not just spikes, but we see an increased level. So we had Afghanistan when the American troops left. We had Yemen, Ethiopia, which has been one of the most dreadful conflicts we have seen since the Cold War. And of course, Russia, Ukraine, and now with Gaza. But there are different ways of measuring people's level or level of conflict. And the way we do it in the report is to look at conflict exposure of women. So what we do here, we look at conflict events where we know where they happen, and then we look at a buffer zone of 50 kilometers around each of these events, and then we basically count how many people live within that area, and we call that a conflict zone. And when we do that, we get this graph. And as you can see, from 1990, from where we have sort of the earliest data that we calculated, and up until 2024, it has more than doubled. So in 2024, 676 million women lived within 50 kilometers of a deadly conflict event. That's 70% of the total world female population. 1 in 6 women live in these conflict areas. Of course, we include conflict events that only include more than one person killed, and that's not a lot. And it's very low intensity conflicts. But the way we have thought about it is that it's so much better to live in a country where there's no conflict than to live close to where at least one person is killed in conflict. And also when we look at, so that's the dark blue line. When we look at this more lighter blue line, that represents women that are living close to more than 25 people being killed. That's 250 million women in the world. And then the bottom orange line, that are women living within 50 kilometers of 100 people being killed. And that's 112 million in 2024. And why is this important to look at? Why is it important to sort of look at exposure? It's because we know through research that living close to conflict increases a lot of negative aspects for women. It increases maternal mortality, heightens risk of gender-based violence, elevates rates of school dropouts for girls, and also sexual violence in war. So it's important to sort of focus not only on how many get killed in conflict, but how many are actually exposed to conflict. This graph, we are trying to convey a lot of information. I'm going to try to walk you through it. On the x-axis, so at the bottom here, we show the share of women living in conflict for each country. On the y-axis, sort of going up, is the Women, Peace and Security Index. And all of the dots represent each country, and the size of the bubble is the number of people being killed in conflict in 2024. What we see with that diagonal line, that's a trend line showing that the more women living in conflict, the lower the Women, Peace and Security Index is. But another interesting thing here is that when we look at the size of these bubbles, the biggest bubbles are actually above the trend line, like Ukraine, Mexico. Mexico is because of all the drug cartels fighting each other. Palestine. So these are the conflicts that we hear about. But if you look in this square, these are the countries which have relatively medium-sized conflicts, but they score very low on the WPS Index, and a lot of people are affected by conflict, even though a lot of people are not killed. And these are also the countries that are suffering the most. These are conflicts that are long. They also score very low on the Human Development Index, and also now with AIDS being or we getting more or less aid, they also have less capacity to deal with conflict. And also, when you get in this situation, recruitment into rebel groups become easier because at some point that is the only viable option for young people. So my hope is that the WPS Index will be able to shine some more light on these conflicts, that it can work even harder to sustain this country. Thank you.
And now I'm going to ask my Georgetown colleague, Halima Hassan, to brief us on the index and go into the kind of details which I'm sure you're all interested in. Halima.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Halima. Thank you for the kind introduction. If I'm not audible at the back, let me know. Thank you, Kim. Can you hear me better? Okay, fantastic. I'm very grateful to be here, very grateful to colleagues at GIWPS and PRIO, to permanent missions of Norway and Japan, and to our fellow speakers and all of you in the audience. So I'm very excited to present the results from the Women, Peace and Security Index 2025 to 2026. The format of my presentation is that I'll very briefly go into what the index is and what it measures. Ambassador Verveer has given us some idea, so I'll elaborate on it briefly. And then I will dive into the key findings, including some of the rankings and compelling pieces of evidence. And then we'll open it up to questions. Okay, so the first question is, what is the WPS Index and what does it measure? So it is a unique and comprehensive tool that scores and ranks countries all over the world across 13 indicators that are grouped into 3 dimensions of women's inclusion, justice, and security. The score ranges from a low of 0 to a high of 1. And we can see here on the visual how these indicators are grouped into each of the dimensions. So you see, for instance, in inclusion, we have indicators like women's parliamentary representation and their education. In justice, we have indicators of legal discrimination or maternal mortality ratio. While in security, as Ambassador Verveer mentioned, we have indicators of how safe women are in their homes and in their communities. So unlike other tools, we're not just focusing on inclusion, but also combining it with justice and security. And this is important because, for instance, financial inclusion is a very powerful instrument to advance women's economic empowerment, but its impact would be very different for women who are facing barriers to justice, or as Sylvie explained, they're living in close proximity to conflict, as compared to women who are not experiencing those circumstances. So in this way, the WPS Index is multidimensional and comparable, provides multidimensional and comparable assessments. Our data also comes from globally recognized and reputable sources, and that is how we construct the index. Some of the reputable sources that we use include databases from the World Bank, the California Report, and the United Nations. So we all know that one of the first steps to advancing women's status is to track and understand their conditions in society, and the index does exactly that. This is the 5th edition of the index. The first one was published in 2017 to 2018. And this year we have 181 countries, which are up from 177 last index. Our approach is 3-layered. So we focus on overall and global analyses, and then we have country group and regional insights. And then finally, we also have some results that are country or theme specific. This allows us to see both the forest and the trees. And I'm happy to elaborate later if anyone's interested on how the countries switch between different years of the index. So without further ado, these are some of the biggest takeaways from the index. So the first one is that message that we've had from the first index, which is that the well-being of women goes hand in hand with the well-being of nations. Societies where women's status is higher are more likely to be peaceful and prosperous, while societies where women's status is poor are often conflict-affected and fragile. The second finding that we see from the index this year is that it reveals a world of crisis, where coinciding with worldwide backlash against women's rights and gender equality, which we just heard about, as well as escalating conflicts globally, our index is also showing stagnating or declining trends of women's status and poor performance across regions, which emphasizes the need for sustained and urgent efforts. At the same time, despite these alarming trends, we're also seeing what we want to call the world of courage, where some of the most notable improvements in the index scores since the first edition are coming from some of the most challenging contexts for women in the world. And we say this not as a comfort, but rather as something to compel us into action and seize this moment to advance women's status. The first key message that I just mentioned is supported throughout our index findings, but a key piece of evidence in that regard is what you see on the screen, which is where we see strong correlations between the WPS index and 4 other indices of national outcomes. We see this correlation with almost 10 other indices. We've just shown 4 here, which is the Fragile States Index, the Positive Peace Index, the Human Development Index, and Notre Dame's Global Adaptation Initiative. What this means is that societies where women's status is higher have lesser fragility, more positive peace, more human development, and they are also more prepared to face the climate crisis. And one important finding that we have from this year, particularly, is that the index has the strongest association with positive peace and fragility this year in particular. A very quick note on positive peace, which is defined as institutions and attitudes and structures that sustain peaceful societies, so it moves beyond conceptions of peace that are limited to the absence of war and violence. Okay, then the next one is some of our global rankings and key results, which again support the first key message. We can see that Denmark again has ranked number 1 on the index. Afghanistan performs the worst at 181. And Denmark scores more than 3 times than Afghanistan, representing the wide range in index rankings. Within the top dozen, all of them are classified to the developed countries group, except for Estonia, which is in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia at number 11. In the top quintile, the majority of the countries are from the developed countries group or the Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia region. We do have some exceptions. One of them is the United Arab Emirates, which is ranked at number 20th and is from the Middle East and North Africa region. We also have Taiwan ranked at number 27th, is from the East Asia and Pacific region. This year, we also have 2 other countries though from the Latin America and Caribbean region joining the top quintile, Costa Rica at number 34 and Uruguay at number 35. This is the first time for both the region and the 2 countries to be in the top quintile of the index rankings. Top quintile is just the top 20% of the rankings. I do have to mention though that these 2 countries are the exception of the rule because several other countries in the Latin American Caribbean region are performing poorly, which is pulling down the region's scores, and we will see that very shortly. But I also want to quickly provide some broad regional trends. You see the graph on the screen, which is showing regional performance by WPS Index score, with the best, worst, and average performer in each region. So it is organized by range. So on the leftmost, you see the developed countries group, which has the narrowest range, which means that developed countries in most countries in that group perform very similarly. Whereas on the rightmost, you see the Middle East and North Africa region, which has the widest range. So that means that within the region, countries perform fairly differently to each other. So you have the United Arab Emirates, as I mentioned, ranked number 20th, and then you have Yemen, which is the second worst ranked at 180th. Some quick results from this, the developed countries group continues to perform the best, having the highest average score across all indicators except for 3, which are parliamentary representation, community safety, and sun bias, and we can talk about this more if anyone's interested in the Q&A. Then, despite a rise in average score, Fragile States group continues to perform the worst out of all country groups and regions, and only 4 countries in that group are in the 3rd quintile. Every other country ranks much lower. After the Fragile States, Sub-Saharan Africa is the 2nd worst regional scorer. After the Fragile States group, countries from the region dominate the bottommost quintile of the index. However, similar to 2023, the Sub-Saharan African group has continued its trajectory to improve women's status, and they've experienced rises in score across 8 indicators out of the 13. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more. This again, why does this matter? Because it again shows us that countries that are not that are doing well in women's status are also ones that are not conflict affected and fragile, whereas those that are performing poorly in women's status. And overall, we see within regions and countries that some countries perform relatively better, but then other countries within a region are performing worse, which means that their overall region score starts to stagnate. And this relates to our next finding, which is what we are calling a world of crisis, where we're seeing that WPS Index score trends are showing stagnation or declining women status. You can see that with the largely flat trend lines. Regional and group average scores have barely shifted since the first edition was published in 2017. All regional scores declined in 2019. Then they recovered in 2021, and since then the performance has been mixed. Two things I want to point out here is that regions that performed relatively better in the past are also starting to decline or stagnate. So for instance, the developed countries group declined in the last edition of the index and has had no change in scores this year. Similarly, the Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia region used to have higher scores, but it declined in the last edition and also in this one. Finally, we see the Latin American Caribbean group, which I mentioned earlier, and it has experienced declines in scores. And in our analysis of looking at countries that have improved or declined the most since the first edition, that the countries in the Latin American Caribbean region dominated the list of most decline. So they experienced the greatest declines since 2017. So this is painting an alarming picture. However, there are some increases if you look at this graph. The first one you can see is East Asia and the Pacific, which has shown some increase or some positive trend over the years. And then we have two very slight increases in a surprising place, which is Sub-Saharan Africa and the fragile states, which have improved. And that's what we're calling a world of courage, which is that amidst these alarming trends, progress seems to come from unlikely places. I mentioned that we were looking at countries that had the largest improvement in scores, and we found that Sub-Saharan Africa countries from Sub-Saharan Africa dominated that list. Half of the top 10 were from Sub-Saharan Africa, and similarly, fragile states, half of the top 10 were countries classified to the fragile states group. Recall that countries that are classified as fragile states are also represented in the regional group. So 3 of those 5 Sub-Saharan African countries are fragile states. And the top 2 that improved the most since 2017 are actually Congo, the Republic of Congo, and South Sudan, both of which are in Sub-Saharan Africa and classified as fragile states. They experienced score increases amounting to 33% and 27% respectively. So this is something that shows us what we are calling a world of courage, where some of these improvements are coming from really conflict-affected and fragile states. Then we also look at the subdimensional trends, but before I get into this graph, one of the things I wanted to mention is that many of the top global performers or improvers across all 3 dimensions since 2017 to 18, or our first index, are also in the fragile states or sub-Saharan African group. However, you saw that their increase was just a slight increase, because that's also because they also have some of the biggest declines across dimensions. So within the country group, there are some countries that have made big improvements, but then also some countries that have made big declines over the years, which is why there is improvement, but the improvement is slight. And that we also want to point out that a lot of these fragile and conflict-affected states are showing improvements against all odds, but there is a lot of conflict and fragility, and women's status there still remains particularly low. But still, we want to focus on and emphasize the improvements that are coming out from these regions. Apart from that, we have, this also helps to explain the overall trends, and we see something similar with the Middle East and North Africa group, where they experience some of the sharpest declines across all of the dimensions, and then their regional trends also show a decline in the regional score. Then coming to the subdimensional performance, we see that there is an increase in the justice score over the years. I think there's a 12% increase overall since 2017, whereas the security dimension declined the most at 7%. However, since the last year, we can also see that justice scores have started to go down. So that trend is also reversing. So now there's, as we painted this picture of a world of crisis and then a world of courage, and we dive more into the indicator performance to understand this well. And we see that there's mixed performance across indicators, and women are still being left behind. So for instance, with the inclusion indicator, we have, and for the inclusion dimension, we have indicators such as women's education, where the average years globally for women's education years is 8.4 years, which is just short of completing secondary school education in most parts of the world. Then similarly, we have employment, where we have a region like Sub-Saharan Africa, which performs exceedingly well in women's employment, but then also regions like the Middle East and North Africa or South Asia, which performed really poorly, and that's kind of third of women are deployed in those regions. Then we also have the security dimension where we see similar results where despite some improvements over, for instance, with community safety, we see that almost more than 1/3 women still feel unsafe in their communities. In this region, the East region, the Pacific, it performs best, whereas the Latin American, the Caribbean region performs worse. Apart from this, the community safety indicator is one of the indicators where the developed countries group does not perform the best, and only 65% of women report feeling safe in their communities in that group overall. Similarly, for security, we see that political violence targeting women has mixed results too. We have 11 fragile states that have reported no political violence against women, which is an encouraging result because it tells us that even within fragility and conflict, political violence against women can be controlled. But at the same time, we have 94 countries where women are experiencing some events of political violence at a minimum. So again, very mixed results and still lots of room for improvement. Finally, with justice, we again see, and earlier speakers also mentioned this, how worsening conflict and aid cuts are impacting a lot of the indicators on our justice dimensions. For instance, maternal mortality ratio is at a lot of reversal of gains, and we talk about that shortly. We also see mixed performances across formal and informal measures of justice. And we did, within the report, we did a case study on the United States. And the graph that you see here is based on a time series analysis, where we have the United States trends over the past almost 2.5 decades, and then we have the average global maternal mortality ratio. And you can see that the United States has had a worsening trend up until the most recent year, and where the maternal deaths have been increasing. Whereas on the other hand, if you compare this in stark contrast with the world average has consistently been improving, but maternal deaths have been declining. So, and we see both the peak in COVID-19, and after that is the first time since 2000 that the United States has had an improvement in its maternal mortality ratio, and even that improvement restores it to the pre-COVID maternal mortality ratios, but it does not improve significantly. And with the current aid cuts and funding challenges, there is a high risk of reversal for this very recent improvement as well. Okay, so in conclusion, we see what we are calling the crisis, which is that as conflicts are reaching a historic high, as Sivi mentioned, we see progress in women's status seems perilously close to a historic low, with stagnating trends and even reversal of gains. At the same time, we're seeing what we are calling a word of courage, where some of the steepest gains since 2017 have emerged from fragile and conflict-affected states. And as I mentioned, this is our intention with this finding is that it should compel us into action. If women have not given up in some of the most challenging contexts in the world, neither should the rest of us. And finally, the future, where we one of the messages of the index is that the future of WPS should not just involve preserving gains and expanding investments into the agenda, but it should also expand the scope of the agenda for it to be more intersectional. We just saw the US maternal mortality rates. A couple of years ago, we did a US WPS index, US specific WPS index, and that revealed that maternal mortality rates was much more higher for Black women, and recent research affirms that. So the index provides a holistic, comparable, and multidimensional view of women's status, while also reminding us that women's realities are differentiated. I reiterate that our results confirm that in societies where women are safe, included, and treated fairly, those societies are more peaceful, resilient both to climate and economic shocks, and prosperous. And at a time of mounting crisis, the WPS agenda is not optional, it is essential. And it is incumbent upon all of us to act urgently so that women, all women everywhere, can live, lead, and thrive in dignity. Thank you. And I think we're ready for questions.
Hi, my name is Manuela Mesa. I am from a Peace Research Center based in Spain. And I have two questions. One, if you consider in the way of doing the index, the Global Peace Index also, because it's also an index that's measured peace, and just to see if it's the same. And the second question is, you consider data inside the country, but not in relation, I mean, countries that have invade or have aggression to other countries. I am thinking on Russia or in Israel, the situation in Gaza. So this is considered in any way, because I was looking at Israel, it seems to me it was in a very good position, even if it is responsible for a genocide in Gaza. So how is this kind of situation, or Russia and Ukraine? So I was wondering how this kind of situation impact in the index. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try and answer your questions, but please tell me if I haven't, and see if you think to jump in. For the first one on the Global Peace Index, we also checked correlations with the GPI, and we found very strong correlations. So that tells us that in societies where women's status is higher, those societies are also more peaceful. And we're seeing again a declining trend in both, unfortunately. So our data is corresponding with other indices as well. On the other one, where we're seeing, for instance, you mentioned Israel and Russia. So for Israel, Israel has declined in index rankings for a fourth consecutive year. So we do see some of the impacts of poor security and the impacts on women's status of that kind of conflict and fragility. And I can again provide more information on what specific indicators that it has declined in. Similarly for Russia, I think Russia ranks 151st, which is not a good ranking on the index. And it has also declined, I think, for a second consecutive year. So those declines are appearing in the data. I would qualify this by saying that there does take some time for changes like this, like our data cannot keep pace with evolving global events. So a lot of changes materialize afterwards. And we also talk about this in another section in the report where we talk about why are some countries climbing the index rankings and not others. And one part of that is that sometimes there's ceasefires that happen or conflicts break out. So you will not see that result in the index that year, but you might see it in the next edition as the data is collected. Having said all of this, we do have a very urgent need for sex disaggregated data, and it is especially pertinent but difficult in conflict-affected settings, including some of the ones that you've mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Hello, Irene Jorosevich, World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations. This is fascinating, and I really have a half a dozen questions, but I'll start with the increase in violence and conflict, there's obviously an increase in refugee problems, and the majority of refugees are usually women. How is the mobility of refugees, or how are refugees calculated in this process, especially, for example, in European countries where generally they have a higher index, but maybe the accessibility to justice or education isn't high? So I'm just curious, that's one question. And then the other one is just quickly, are there indicators for the countries that have improved, let's say Ghana unexpectedly? Have you been able to identify certain indicators? For example, is it sudden end of war, or is it an improvement in the political situation, or is it suddenly rapid investment? I'm just curious what the indicators are for that improvement.
No, thank you so much for your question. I think for the first one, which is on refugees and the impact of the refugee crisis, you're absolutely right. I think one of the stats that we have in the report is that 117.5 million of the displaced in the world half of them are women. And a lot of that displacement is driven by conflict. So it's a very important question. I think you won't see those impacts immediately or directly in the index because we have to work within the constraints of the data we have. In order to have a comparable index where we can rank different countries, we need to use global data sets that are provided by the World Bank, the International Labour Organization, all these reputable and credible sources. But that also means the amount of disaggregation we have is limited. But that is, again, a great avenue for research and something that should definitely be looked into. And it would be something that we would also love to investigate further. I think on your other question on what indicators countries have improved in, there was something that I wanted to mention. I think we have a case study of Yemen, for instance, and Yemen is still ranked the second worst on the index, but it has demonstrated some remarkable improvements. And we see the indicator rises could be on different indicators, but we see three common patterns. One is that countries have sustained improvements across different indicators. So it won't be very large improvements, but it will be sustained and consistent improvements across a number of indicators over time. So that is one way that we see some of these unlikely improvements. Another way would be that they make large gains in specific indicators. So for instance, in Yemen's case, Yemen had big gains in women's cell phone use. And that in itself has an impact on other indicators also. We have heard similar feedback from Yemeni civil society leaders, women's civil society leaders, who told us that the proliferation of cell phones has really empowered women economically. So you might see that in employment, even if it's in informal employment. So the gains vary, but there are, for each country, there are either gains across multiple indicators over time, or you see large gains in specific indicators.
Thank you.
Question back in.
Thank you so much for a very comprehensive presentation. My name is Helena Grönberg. I'm with the International Civil Society Action Network, ICANN. I had a question, if you could talk a little bit more about the methodology, and particularly I'm curious how you, in addition to using those big data sets from UN, World Bank, et cetera, how you also, validate your data, triangulate maybe with surveys with civil society. And I know you mentioned a little bit on the case study, specifically on Yemen, that you clearly had some conversations. So would love to hear more about that. And then how, and if you use the big survey that Georgetown did earlier this year to feed into the index, and if so, how? Thank you so much.
No, thank you for your question. I think on the methodology, we try to balance ensuring that the index is comparable because these are rankings. So for instance, if we're comparing two countries within a region, we need to ensure that the data that we're utilizing has similar methodologies, which is why we're using certain databases. For instance, there are countries, including such as Yemen, which might have different kinds of data for employment that are coming from national or local sources or from civil society sources. But if their methodology is different, we cannot adopt it because then that employment percentage will not be comparable to another country. So then we cannot reflect it in the rankings. And part of the index's uniqueness and value add is that it allows us to make those comparisons and see how women's absolute status is relative to each other. So I think there's that delicate balance. What we absolutely do is that we have a host of research. So like you mentioned, we have a survey which covers those aspects and we hear directly from women peace builders and women activists on the ground. And we've incorporated those remarks and those insights into the report. So you might not see that in the rankings as a number, but they're incorporated throughout the report. We also then again cite civil society research, surveys, and complement a lot of our findings with that secondary research. So I think that's the delicate balance that we have to ensure that this is a tool that's multidimensional and comparable, while at the same time trying to include perspectives from the ground and have that intersectional analysis.
Hi, I'm Signe Gild and I'm from Norway. I just wonder two things. I saw that the COVID-19, it seems it's been kicking in, some of the effects of the COVID when it comes to the indicators and the status of women. But can you say a little bit more about that? And it's connected to the other question, which is more about prevention, because we see a proliferation of conflicts, but how do we prevent conflicts and how can this data material assist us in diving into that and what we need to do? Thank you.
No, thank you for the question. Both very important. So please let me know if you want to jump in. But I think on COVID, yes. I think our 2023 index also talks about, the previous edition talks about this, about the impact of COVID across all indicators. One example that's coming to my mind is the maternal mortality ratio, which was recently updated, and we included that updated data in our index, and it showed that globally there were 40,000 additional maternal deaths because of COVID. So if we go back to our graph on maternal mortality, we see that huge peak over there. And it also, again, reversed the declining trend globally as well. Having said that, there have also been concentrated efforts that are trying to rectify this. Again, for maternal mortality, an example that comes to mind is South Sudan, which in the last index had the highest rates of maternal deaths. I think at 1,200 deaths per 100,000 live births. And in this index, South Sudan has half that number. So, and we discussed in the index how there are multiple civil society initiatives that are and working with women's leadership and with committed governments to address a lot of the effects of COVID. The challenge with that now is that we also have funding cuts and a global rise in backlash as well as conflicts. So we might expect a lot of these gains to be reversed. So there has been some improvement since COVID and it had a major impact, but we're now starting to see again reversals to some of those recovery. I think on the other question about what we can do or how we can use this tool, I think it allows us to first have these holistic assessments. One of the things, for instance, with the index that we see is how countries perform differently across different dimensions, which is why we have a multidimensional assessment. So countries can look at, they might be doing very well, for instance, on justice or on inclusion, but very poorly on security. So it helps countries identify what is specific areas that they can focus on. And that's true not just for governments, but also for civil society, for advocates, for journalists, to incorporate this into their work. If you also look at the report, we have this visualization, which we call the traffic light visualization. It's towards the end at page 12. This basically tells us that where countries are performing well, where they're doing worse, and where they have no change or the best score. So that is also a place for countries to look at. These are indicators that we're doing poorly or our gains are reversing, and there are other areas where we can do better. So I think that's another way. There's lots of insight in the index where there are targeted interventions that countries can focus on, and then they can look at overall dimensions and think about how to improve. So I think our response is to do what happens.
You want to say something about it? So, in terms of preventing conflict, that's obviously a very difficult question. But I think one thing that's important that the index can help us shine light on is women's participation in peace processes. The importance of including women in all of these processes, and that the index can sort of heighten the focus on.
Thank you, Siri. Before I put you with that question, one thing I also wanted to mention is that we also see we have the 4 pillars of the WPS agenda, which talks about, for instance, if women are not safe in their communities or homes, they will be unable to participate in these processes. So all these 3 dimensions go hand in hand. And the idea is for countries to look at this holistically and focus on what are the areas they can advance women's status.
Thank you. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Lena Kvalving from the Nordic Center for Gender and Military Operations. I'm also a member of the Nordic Women Mediators Network. I just wanted to start out by saying thank you so much for this brilliant work. It's really helpful for us that educate and train in these topics from the tactical to the strategic level. So thank you, it's really useful for us. I just had a brief question. You mentioned something about how many women live in the close proximity of crisis. And I was just wondering if you have a comparison, if you compare that to men in the same.
So I guess the answer is that the other half are men. So it's about there's about 1.3 billion people living in conflict. So so what we do is that we take the share of women in a country and then we calculate it based on that. And there's slightly more women than men. We also look at children, and for children the share is higher because there are more young people than old people in the world. But yeah, it's about half. That's
Hello, my name is Sandra Petersen. I'm from the Norwegian Human Rights Fund, and I'm also a research fellow at the Norwegian Center for Human Rights. I was just wondering about your indicators in terms of civil society participation, women's access to possibility to, for instance, engage in civic action, receive funding, kind of core rights that are needed to defend human rights. So a question is, if you've been discussing if this could be some indicators for you to assess women's participation in certain countries or in the index.
Thank you for the question. I think that is absolutely a very important question. I think it is indirectly reflected in the index and our indicators because we look at participation, for instance, women's parliamentary representation, or women's employment, women's education. So a lot of the indicators in the inclusion dimension are pertaining to that. I think in terms of civic action, we have again an indirect relation because if women's civic action improves, you will see it across all 3 dimensions and across all 13 indicators. And I think some of the country case studies that we have are showing that those trends or the importance of that. So just very quickly, these are our indicators. Some of them are showing participation at different levels, which are tied to civil society, but not directly. However, for instance, again, we have Yemen's example, we have Ukraine's example, where we see very conflict-affected countries, but there are some improvements across their indicators. And although we couldn't do an extensive investigation to why that is, the research that we were able to do within our capacity points to their civic participation and their leadership in civil society work. And this is particularly true for Ukraine. So our secondary research is telling us that some of the changes that we're seeing across our indicators, especially for conflict-affected or fragile countries, are because of women's civic participation. But it's an indirect relation, but inevitably it will show up in the indicators if women have that civic action. And I think the reverse is also true. So if the women are not secure in their homes or in their communities, or they do not have higher education levels, or they have high maternal deaths, their ability to participate in civil society will be affected. So it works both ways. That answers the question. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Audma Jokovic, the Ambassador for Equality of the European Union for Eastern Action Service. I have one question. To what extent your index also captures the violence online? Because you also talked about political violence and all that is related to that. And maybe just a small comment on the comment that was made behind. I think that when you say that there are more women in areas of conflict, and then you say, yeah, the other half is men, I think our issue is that we have to convince people that there is a specific issue to women. So we will probably need the full narrative behind, understand why this is specific and why.
So you feel free to jump in. On violence online, I think that's a very important question. And again, because we rely on global data that is reputable and credible, a lot of that data does not, none of the data, for instance, for political violence incorporates online violence, but we're strong advocates of it, and we hope to see that incorporated in the data sets that we use. But I think we've added some secondary research to complement our findings and explain that technology-facilitated gender-based violence has very specific and harmful impacts for women, and those impacts are across all dimensions, so not just limited to security, which is the dimension that we categorize our political violence indicator, but it has implications for all indicators. So I think we've added the secondary research, and there is now data emerging on a lot of the impacts of online violence, but I think our current databases from the World Bank, from ILO, from the UN, they currently don't incorporate that, but we're hoping to see that incorporated in the future as the urgency and importance of this phenomenon becomes apparent. So I think that was the first one. On the second question about, I'll let Siri jump in, but I just wanted to say that our index is also unique in that it measures absolute status of, absolute levels of women's status. So there are indices that measures gaps, but I think part of what we're trying to say here is this is how women are doing, irrespective of how men are doing in society. And one of the reasons is that you will see, for instance, in some of the measurements of gender gaps between men and women, that in societies where men are also doing very poorly, but the gap is smaller, it will show those societies performing well on those indices, even if women are also doing poorly. It's just that both men and women are doing poorly. So I think our idea is to show how are women doing in society, irrespective of the status of men. But I'll let Siri also.
But you're, of course, absolutely right that women and men experience conflict differently. And I was trying to rush through my presentation, but what we do see from research is that living in these conflict zones increases maternal mortality, it increases gender-based violence, it increases sexual violence, it decreases dropout from school, particularly with girls. There's a number of issues that are worse for women living in these conflict zones. So even if as many men and women live in these conflict zones, we do focus on women, and also for the reasons that Halima mentions.
If you wanted to add to that, you mentioned political violence targeting women, and I think the report has that. But for instance, the rate of political violence targeting women in countries that perform the worst on proximity to conflict is 3 times higher than the global average. So to Siri's point, there's that you see that and it's I think almost comparable to the bottom performing countries overall on the index. So I think that might help make the case, as you're saying. Any other questions?
So thank you for this study. I'm Catherine Della. I'm working for the Department of Peace Operations. And I would like to know if in your study you could find the improvement correlated with the presence of the peacekeeping mission in some of the countries. You mentioned the case of South Sudan, seeing that the situation is now reversing. So maybe it was before. Maybe the positive aspect was when the mission was able to maybe protect the civilians and including also, of course, the women. So just really interested in seeing a correlation between improvement of the WPS in those conflict areas where there is a peacekeeping mission. Thank you.
No, thank you for the question. It's a very important question. I think first on peacekeeping missions, when we look at other indices that have some measurements of peace or freedom or levels of democracy, we look at 10 other indices of such national outcomes, and we find strong correlations with 8 of them and moderately strong with 2 others. So that correlation is there very strongly. So if there are a lot of those other indices measure whether women are represented in peacekeeping missions, and if they are, those indices, they would improve. And since our index is positively correlated with them, that also means that their status in society moves up with it. So that correlation is definitely there. I think, for instance, you mentioned South Sudan's case. And yes, there are examples of women's participation. We talk about this in the report for South Sudan particularly as well. But there are also several examples of how women have been sidelined from some of those peacekeeping processes, both formal and informal. And I think within the index, a good example on the side on the screen is points to that, where we see examples of countries like Yemen, like Republic of Congo, like South Sudan, where we are seeing those improvements, and they're since the first index, so since 2017 to 18 till now, it's a trend, and it's the improvement, but they're still in some of the most bottom-ranked countries. And part of that is that there's a big gap to bridge still. So while we're witnessing those improvements, they might not improve, for instance, in the rankings because there's a gap to bridge, and it needs the participation and the representation in peacekeeping missions or other peace processes needs to be sustained throughout in order for these countries to move up on things and indicate that women's status has improved. Thank you. Your next question. Yes. You've been waiting, sorry.
Thank you. I'm Hasina Sherza from Norwegian Human Rights Watch. I was wondering if the index looks at women who are in exile in cases of, for example, Afghanistan. Most of the leadership are women who can participate, has left the country, but then they don't represent how the situation inside the country is, but they are quite taking active part, or they're now leading almost the whole civic space and what's happening with Afghanistan, or maybe in case of crime. Women that leaves behind, and if the index looks at it and how it affects the country, and also if there's a measure for them in the host country. Thank you.
No, again, I think that's a really important point. And I think, again, we've used secondary data to complement this. I think these are very important aspects, and it would be great if we could also complement a global index with national indices. We've done some national analyses in the past, and we're very interested in doing it in the future as well. But I think for there is definitely a possibility, again, depending on availability and coverage for global data, to incorporate those aspects. And I think all of us at GIWPS and PRIO are strong advocates of incorporating those other identities and aspects of women's participation. But the current data sets that we have don't incorporate this directly. Again, as someone asked earlier about civic action, this is reflected indirectly, and we see it for Afghanistan also, but it's not directly reflected because we're using global data sets, and especially from specific sources that have had their data validated. But another solution until that those global data sets incorporate these other aspects is to have national indices that can really focus on country context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Daria. I'm special envoy for WPS from Slovenia. I have actually, I would like to ask you to share with us if you have any kind of feedback. You release the index. So, do you have countries coming to you asking how you what was the ratio between certain index that are measured, and if they are asking you for advice? Because index is very important, but you know, you have to supply also advice afterwards. Maybe we can supply the advice. I don't know.
Yeah.
The second, you had several geographic regions, and one that is not a region, but we call it developed countries. So I'm wondering on what basis do you have these developed countries? On the basis of OECD membership, or which basis? Because all other groups are regional and
Yes.
connected with the geographic phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for both questions. I think I'll answer the latter one first, which is on regions. We use the UNDP classifications, and so the developed countries is treated as a geographic group, but it is based on levels of human development or income. We do have those country groups separately, but we just use the classification from UNDP as is done with several other index reports. So that's the approach with that. We also have fragile states, which is not a regional group, but is classified by the World Bank based on fragility of institutions or the level of conflict countries are experiencing. The other question you had on what advice we can give, and we actually have tied on, I think there's Slovenia. We're waiting for it to come back. But one of the ways that we can advise is to have, for instance, that traffic light visualization, which points out specific areas that countries can improve. I think we can also point out the specific indicators that countries are improving in. So for instance, we have Slovenia, which went from 36th in the last index to 14th in the current one. So they rose in rankings. And
But we went from 4th place to 36. That was the 2017, which we were sharing the index with Norway.
yeah, very true. And that is the trajectory that we're trying to trace in the index. So we talk about why did Slovenia go from 4th to 36, or now why has it risen? And we point out specific indicators where we see a decline or we see improvements to see what is affecting women's status in countries like Slovenia. So I think that is one way that we can provide advice. And again, we would love to do national indices, places that we can provide that sort of investigation in the level of depth that it requires.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay. I think that's it from all of us. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have some closing remarks. We have Tarun from PRIO, and I will let you make the closing remarks. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Halima, for your good presentation of the index. And to the special envoy from Slovenia, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing so much poorer when you go up and down. You could deliver just as well as you did the previous years, but there are other countries who are improving more. So it's relative. And it's the same with Norway. We are going up and down. First index, I think we were number 1, then suddenly we were down at number 7 or 8, and now I think we are again, so it's but the difference is
Denmark is on the top.
Denmark is still on top. It's hard for us in Norway to accept, but still. Anyway, Excellencies, ambassadors, everyone, as mentioned by several speakers here today, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is at a critical juncture. Only a few years back, many of us who have been working on this agenda, even since before it was as an agenda, and I see quite a few of these pioneers in the room here today, we were actually looking forward to the 25th anniversary. We thought that this would be a nice opportunity to discuss critically the status of this agenda, and hopefully also maybe come up with progressive suggestions as to how to take this agenda forward. Now the anniversary is upon us. The world has changed quite dramatically in just the past few years, leaving us with very little space to do any of this, to discuss critically or innovate. And I think this is actually quite sad. On the contrary, we see that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is subject to growing backlash and stagnation across both countries and regions, as pointed to by you, Ambassador, but also underscored by the index. In the 25 years that have passed since Resolution 1325 was adopted, research on the gender dimension of peace and conflict has expanded considerably. And much of this research has focused on making women visible and making their voices heard through documentation of their activities and contributions. And a lot of, qualitative studies, doing interviews with these women. So much knowledge is already out there and more is needed. But most of all, I think the knowledge we have must be applied by policymakers and practitioners alike, because we know so much. Still, in the most recent report of the UN Secretary General, the progress report that he submitted to the UN Security Council, he calls for a gender data revolution on women, peace and security, a data revolution focused on, and I quote, identifying data gaps and exploring how greater access and use of gender data will be essential to break patterns of stagnation and regression and uphold the promise of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. End of quote. And I'm glad to see that the Women, Peace and Security Index is actually mentioned in the Secretary General's report as an example of how the access to data and trend analysis on peace and security has been expanded in recent years. Having published the index report biannually now since 2017, we are now able to do just that, provide trend analysis on women, peace and security. And we hope that the index can serve as an inspiration for action for member states and other actors alike, at least that this is the feedback we get from both governments and civil society organizations when we present the index at various events and conferences around the world. The index can raise the alarm over particularly worrying developments, but hopefully also serve as a tool to identify where the needs for new investments and initiatives are most pressing. And the index data is available, open access, and I want to remind you about that. It is available for anyone to explore further, and it's available on the webpage of the Georgetown Institute on Women, Peace and Security. So please make use of it. I would like to end my remarks by thanking you all for joining us here today, both all of you in the room here physically, but also all of you joining us online. A warm thanks to the ambassadors, Merete Fjelldattested and Yamazaki Kashibuki, I hope I pronounced it correctly, from the permanent missions of Norway and Japan for co-hosting this event, together with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security and us at the PRIO Center on Gender, Peace and Security. A special thanks to you, Milan, and your team, and Halima,
as the lead author of this report. You have done really, really great work and worked really hard to make this index ready in time for the launch. And thanks also to Siri, my colleague, for providing the important content data analysis. Finally, I would also like to extend a special thanks to the government of Norway for providing funding to produce this index. Together with our partners at Georgetown, the PRIO Center on Gender, Peace and Security, and the PRIO Center on Security, we really appreciate your staunch support to this agenda. And you have been a lead nation for many, many years. At a time when women's rights and gender equality are increasingly put under pressure globally, it is really important that countries such as Norway and now also Japan continues to play a leading role in advancing this agenda. I'm not thinking only normatively and politically, but also financially, because we see a real financial crisis now. And coming from a research institute, of course, the importance of funding research. We at PRIO, we believe strongly in the importance of evidence-based policymaking to achieve inclusive and sustainable peace and development. We really need, solid knowledge to take this agenda forward. So thank you, and thank you for coming. Thank you. Because I was